The winter of 1943 had left the fields of Normandy brittle and grey. The earth hardened beneath a frost that seemed to gnaw at the marrow of the land itself. In my attic room above the shuttered boulangerie in Saint-Mere-Église, a place I had not baked a single loaf in since the occupation begun, I sat hunched over the disassembled carcass of a SX-28, its vacuum tubes glowing faintly like the last embers of a banked fire. Outside, the wind carried the metallic temps of distant shelling and the low, rhythmic thrum of Wehrmacht patrols moving along the coastal roads. I had long grown accustomed to the silence that followed such sounds. The silence of neighbors who no longer spoke to one another, the silence of children who had learned not to cry. My hands, stained with solder and grease, moved with a precision born of desperation rather than skill. I was no engineer, only a former radio technician for France Telecom, now reduced to cobbling together resistance coils from salvaged telegraph wire and tuning condensers with a screwdriver blunted by time and scarcity. Yet necessity had made me cunning. The attic had become my sanctuary and my prison. Its slanted eaves, whispering with intercepted fragments of Enigma chatter, BBC-coded bulletins, and, on rare nights when the ionosphere cooperated, the faint ghost of Morse from SOE operatives deep behind enemy lines. The Germans swept the bands constantly, their Funkabware units triangulating with brutal efficiency. One misstep or frequency held too long. A modulation to clean and I would be dragged from this room before dawn. My bread oven repurposed for something far darker. It was on the night of March 17, 1944, just after 2,200 hours, that the signal came. Not from London, not from Algiers, but from a frequency long thought abandoned, 6,412 kilohertz. The old BC 610 band reserved for Jedburgh teams during Operation Torch. Static hissed, like rain on slate, then clear, deliberate, trembling with distortion, a series of dots and dashes. I transcribed it instinctively, my pencil scratching across a scrap of rock. Victor India Echo Romeo Foxtrot Delta Quebec November Tango Standard Allied Security Check-in Protocol VRF DQNT. But the sequence made no sense. No known agent used that call sign. And then came the kicker. The operator appended the emergency duress code Zebra, 3 rapid dashes followed by a pause, and 2 dots indicating capture imminent. My blood turned to ice water. No one had transmitted on that channel since November 42. Jean-Luc Moromi, cousin, my only brother in spirit, had vanished during the Marseille landings, using that very frequency. His body was never found, only his cipher pad, waterlogged and torn, dredged from the viewport by fishermen a week later. I stared at the paper until the letters blurred. Logic screamed. A trap. The Opfair had been known to replay recorded transmissions, baiting resistance nets with phantom calls. Yet something in the timing of the irregular spacing between characters, the faint harmonic wobble of a hand key worn smooth by years of use, felt like Jean. Oh, my memory of him. And perhaps that was the cruelest trick of all, that grief could mimic authenticity. For hours I sat paralyzed, the radio humming softly, the cold seeping through my woolen vest. Downstairs, Madame Leclerc snored through the thin floorboards, unaware that upstairs, in the dark, a dead man was speaking. By 0200, I had made my choice, not out of conviction, but out of a terrible, knowing need to believe he might still be alive. I powered up the transmitter, the one eye, jury-rigged from a German Feldfernsprecher and a scavenged Marconi oscillator, and began to type. I fabricated a reply using an obsolete double transposition cipher, layering it with a false checksum and a routing prefix that mimicked the BBC's personal messages format. I signed it with Jean-Luc's old authentication token Falcon. Still flies a phrase only he and I knew from our boyhood days, watching peregrines dive over the cliffs of it. Then, voice trembling only slightly, I keyed the mic and sent it in clear voice, low and steady. At 023, 7 hours. Message received. Stand by for extraction. Convoy OW77 changeth route. E-boat patrol shifted to Cherbourg sector. Expect cover from 463rd Hof. Acknowledge I knew OW77 didn't exist. The 463rd flew Lancasters over Germany, not coastal cover. But if the Germans were listening, if they believed this dead man was still active, they might take the bait, and if they did, they would redeploy. That was the gamble. Not to save Jean-Luc, but to sow doubt where certainty had reigned. I switched off the set. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Somewhere in the static, I imagined Jean-Luc's ghost nodding or weeping. 3 days later, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance report, intercepted by British WWII service and relayed through a compromised Abwehr leak, noted unusual panzer movements in the Pas. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen, was ordered to reinforce coastal batteries near Le Havre. The reason cited in internal German communiques, credible transmission indicating Allied feint toward Cherbourg, with real landings expected near Calais. I had not intended this. I had only meant to answer a ghost. But the ghosts, it seemed, had begun to answer back. Dawn on the 1st of April arrived not with birdsong but with the sour stench of wet cordite and burning rubber drifting from the road to Carrington. I had not slept. The radio sat silent, its dials cold, yet my mind crackled with phantom echoes. Every hour since my transmission, I expected boots on the stairs, the splintering of the trapdoor, the cold kiss of a Luger against my temple. But the Germans did not come for me. They went elsewhere. By mid-April, fragments began to surface through Baker's gossip, through the coded laundry lines of the resistance, through BBC's midnight broadcast disguised as poetry. Reports spoke of unusual Wehrmacht activity. The 716th Static Division reinforcing artillery positions near The 21st Panzer pulled from Caen and marched east under cover of night. Coastal radar units recalibrated to scan the English Channel toward Dover, not Utah Beach. The deception, my desperate fiction, had taken root in the fertile soil of German paranoia. High Command, already obsessed with Calais as the logical invasion point, now had confirmation from a source they believed authentic. A captured SOE agent still transmitting under duress, feeding them false intelligence to save his life. They never questioned why the signal originated from Normandy. They assumed he was being moved. I should have felt triumph. Instead, a quiet nausea coiled in my gut. I had not saved a life, I had conjured a lie so convincing it reshaped the battlefield. And in doing so, I had made myself complicit in a far grander theater of illusion. One orchestrated by men in Whitehall who would never know my name, nor care if I hanged for it. The moral weight was not in the act itself, but in its anonymity. No medal, no witness, only the knowledge that hundreds, perhaps thousands of young men might live or die because of words I invented in a freezing attic. May passed in a fever of tension. The Luftwaffe increased reconnaissance flights. U-boats prowled farther west. I received no further signals on 6,412 kilohertz. Jean-Luc's ghost, if it had ever been real, had fallen silent again. Yet every time I tuned the dial, I half expected to hear his voice nod in Morse. But speaking plainly, as he once did over absinthe in Montmartre, you always were too clever for your own good. Etienne. Then, on June 5th, just after midnight, the BBC broadcast, Les sanglots, lunes, des violons. They allude Verlenze poem the long-awaited signal for DDay. My hands shook as I powered up the receiver one last time. Static then, faint but unmistakable. The drone of hundreds of Allied engines crossing the channel. I climbed to the roof, risking the searchlights, and saw them dark shapes blotting out the stars, descending toward the coast like a biblical plague made of steel and courage. I wept then, not from fear, but from a strange, unbearable relief. The lie had held. The landings began at 063 hours. Noon. Sainte-Mère Église was liberated partly because the German reserves were still waiting for an invasion that would never come at Calais. I watched paratroopers from the 82nd drag wounded comrades through the square where I once sold baguettes. One of them, a boy no older than 20, with mud-caked cheeks and eyes wide as saucers, dropped his canteen near my doorway. I gave him water. He thanked me in broken French and asked if I'd seen any Krauts. I shook my head. I said nothing of radios, of ghosts, of codes. Weeks later, as the Allies pushed inland, A British intelligence officer in a crisp khaki uniform visited the town. He asked about resistance activity, about radio contacts. I told him nothing. He showed me a list of Agent Jean Lutz's name was there, marked presumed KIA, November 1942. When the officer left, I burned my notes, smashed the SX-2 8-wheater wrench, and buried the pieces beneath the old apple tree behind the bakery. But the truth lingers. Even when silenced, on quiet nights, when the wind blows east from the coast, I still hear it not a signal, but the echo of my own voice, repeating a lie that became history. I did not change D-Day. No single man does. But I whispered into the void, and the war listened. And sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, I wonder, was it Gun Lutz's ghost I heard, or merely my own conscience, dressed in his voice?